everybody, it's me and Buster Green. Well, the day has come at last. Unfortunately, as fast as it came, it's finally gone. A few weeks ago, the 2022 Urusei Yatsura remake finally ended after a 2-year run, and as it ended, the entire internet woke up to be kind of shocked with a massive, what, that was it? That's all you got? You're giving up already? Well, I guess now that's finally over, I'm going to take one last hard look at the series and fully analyze it, because overall, the remake's kind of hard to recommend if you're a newcomer. Like, if you're new to the series, my overall recommendation would be do not watch this. Start in 1981, work your way to the 1990s, and then come back to this one. Like, overall, David Productions tried very hard to redo these episodes. They tried to make them more faithful to the manga. They tried to make the animation better. They put a fun modern coat of animation on this old story. And I give them credit where credit is due, that they did a hard job on this. And this was a hard job adapting a show that's already been adapted perfectly in the 1980s. They tried to do it a little bit more straight to the manga, and they tried to not be influenced by the old 1980s version, but I think if anything, that was a huge mistake on their part, because the 80s version was just already too perfect. The 80s version had perfect comedy timing, perfect risque humor, perfect sexuality, and unfortunately the 2022 seasons just never got close to that, and were never able to replicate that original vibe of like summer in the 80s that the original series just flows through. Now, when the show first started 2 years ago, I told everyone that I wasn't going to review this, and I said that because at the time, I was very worried that the show would run for 200 episodes like the 1980s version did. But you know what? It did it, so screw it. I'm going to review the whole thing right now. Ha ha! Okay, so Season 1. Urusei Yatsura Season 1. It's an entertaining speedrun back to the status quo that the 1980s version left off on. But there's so much heart and soul missing here that I can't really recommend Season 1. There's almost really nothing good in it. Like, Megane isn't in the show, and he's one of the early driving factors that makes the original anime so good for me. Like, I know they made this character up so Shigeru Chiba could just improvise and, like, fuck with the show. But beyond that, he really does make the show better, and maybe I should just do a video essay about why Megane is so important to the show, but having an Urusei Yatsura without Megane versus an Urusei Yatsura with Megane, I definitely would much rather have Megane in the mix. So yeah, let me know if you want a video essay on Megane. I'll think about doing it in the future. But yeah, the remake's been canceled. There wasn't enough Megane, and yeah, anyway, maybe I'll forget about it because the Urusei Yatsura boom is over. Anyway, yeah, so even major characters like Ataru, Shinobu, and Mendo, they're badly fleshed out in the remake compared to their original carefully crafted 80s versions. And most of them just comes down to the time you spent with them and the overall pacing of the old series versus the new series. Like, overall, the new series is paced way too fast. They rush through a lot, and overall that leads to the whole series just feeling a lot more shallow than the 8 version in a way that I can't really be happy with it. Now, that was Season 1. In Season 2, they did kind of learn a little, and the vibe changed a little, because Season 1 underperformed, and I think they kind of knew they were getting canceled, so maybe they leaned harder into that vintage fans were keeping them afloat. Maybe they leaned harder into they knew they were running out of time, so they got their act together. So what happens in Season 2, they start getting a little bit more serious, and they start focusing more on stories that happened near the end of the original Urusei Yatsura's run, because what happened in the 80s was the show got canceled before the manga got canceled. So there are like a handful of like truncated stories right at the end of the manga that have never been properly adapted. Season 2, if anything, was trying to be more of an epilogue to the 1980s anime, trying to once again wrap out all the long-running loose ends the series had as it stretched over so many decades. And so now I'm going to break down this breakdown even further and try to sum up each episode from the Urusei Yatsura remake and say whether the episode was worth watching, not worth watching, if the 80s version did it better, or if maybe both versions of the show just couldn't get this one right. I'll try to put some math in here to determine how mathematically useless or watchable Urusei Yatsura 2022 actually was. Alright, let's begin. Season 1, Episode 1A, Young Love on the Run. So right from the get-go, David Production wowed us with our faster, flashier remake here, and this is our first episode. Now, I guess taking away from this, I guess you can kind of figure out that the overall plan for the remake of the show is faster and flashier, but overall that's just not as satisfying because there was a lot of like goofy shit that went down in the first episode. There was a lot of sexuality and all that got cut out. What did almost justify the remake, though, was in the first episode, episode 1B. The B story was between a rock and a hard place, and this is a story where Lum nearly destroys the town's phone lines in an abusive rage out at the fact that Ataru and Shinobu are not taking her seriously as a threat to their relationship. This is probably one of the rare episodes I will say that the remake did better than the 80s version, because I think it put it up front. I think it put a little bit more time into it. And meanwhile, in the 80s version, the story kind of got diluted to the point where I kind of lost track of the chaos of it all. So I actually enjoyed episode 1B, seeing a more true to the manga version of this story. And at the time when the show was starting, it seemed like this episode seized my attention because I was really curious about what the remake was going to be, if it was going to be more faithful to the manga like this episode was. And I guess overall it was, but none of the future episodes hit quite with the same amount of impact as this first one did. I mean, this is the first one that I pieced together that they were still set in the 80s, even though the series is being made in 2022. How wacky is that? Episode 2A, Present for You. This is where Sakura is introduced, and I'll say the 2022 version is a little bit better than the 80s version because the 80s version has exceptionally bad animation. I'm not sure what happened on this one, but this one is a standout of bad animation among the 80s series. Episode 2B, The Yellow Ribbon of Happiness. Now, here's where I think 2022 starts losing its way, because they start throwing off the timeline way too much. So this episode introduces Mendo hella early, and I think throwing out a story about Lum losing her powers on the second episode just doesn't hit quite as hard with the same impact it did in the 80s, where this was held off until episode 7. And again, the 80s version is better because in the 80s version, Megane contributes a lot to the plot in this episode. Episode 3A, Trouble Rains Down. So this is our full introduction to Mendo, and in 2022 they added a running gag here where he gets trapped in places that give him extreme claustrophobia and he whines like a little baby. Now, I don't remember this joke happening at all in the 80s version, and they really play up this joke a lot in the 2022 version, and the joke just makes Mendo look a little bit more stupid when initially he was presented with a certain air of competency. Episode 3B, Amazed in a Maze. Alright, so Lum, Ataru, Mendo, and Shinobu get trapped in a cave, and this is another good excuse to focus on the full extent of their love quadrangle, as well as the new Mendo's new fear of claustrophobia. So I like this episode a lot, but I think this is another big episode that really puts into picture the problem of pacing that the 2002 remake has. Because in the original 80s show, I want to say there are literally hundreds of episodes trying to sort out the love Shinobu, Ataru, Mendo love quadrangle. And in 2022, this is probably the only episode that focuses on it and directly confronts it, and otherwise it gets pushed to the background behind all the chaos. So that kind of sucks. So I like this episode, but unfortunately this is one of the highs in what would otherwise be a long series of lows. Episode 4, Seal with a Kiss. So this is the episode introducing Princess Kurama, the princess of alien crows who comes down from space, and she instantly gets caught between Mendo and Ataru's perversions. Maybe they introduced Mendo early so they could skip straight to this. So this was a nice classic episode to throw out, but I'm kind of let down that Princess Kurama never barely appears again after this episode. Episode 5A, The Glove of Love and Conflict. So this is the episode where Sakura starts working as a school nurse. I find it weird that they needed to explain this, whereas in the 80s, I think she was just always a school nurse. That was her status quo. I'm going to officially declare this as the first outright bad episode of the remake because it felt unnecessary. Episode 5B, the Love Letter Valentine's Day episode. Okay, so this one is maybe one of the most complicated episodes in the remake. Long story short, in the original 1980s version, Mamoru Oshii went to town on this story. He jazzed the shit out of it. He made it a complicated Christmas special. He added major subplots for Ten and Megane, and he stretched it to a full half hour. He made it into an excellent early story about how Ataru is slowly developing feelings for Lum and how their relationship is blossoming. Now, to do that, he also completely dropped a subplot on Mendo, and technically this was a Mendo-centered storyline. Now, on the flip side, 2022 does none of that jazz in that Oshii did, and it does give you that original Mendo storyline, which is basically just haha, Mendo ruined Valentine's Day. So, honestly, these two stories are so different that it's hard to compare them. I guess I'm going to say this is an interesting episode of the remake to watch because it is so different from the 80s version. But on the flip side, the 80s version is a masterpiece of a Christmas special. So both are good. It's really hard to compare these ones. Episode 6A, the Ben 10 introduction episode. Now, this episode is bad in the remake. This episode is very poorly done, and I do not like it. They introduced Ben 10 a lot better in the 80s, and in the 80s, she had black hair instead of being a redhead. Episode 6B, the Oyuki introduction episode. Now, on the flip side, I was actually pleasantly surprised with this one. This is a faithful adaptation of Oyuki's manga intro, except Mendo wasn't in the manga, so they shoehorned Mendo into the plot of this one. Otherwise, I feel like this one is actually doing the story more justice than the original 80s series did. So yeah, this is one of the good episodes where I give the remake a point. Episode 7 is entirely about a water yokai goblin monster. Now, I'm very confused about this episode. I guess this episode is good if you just consider it a standalone episode. And yeah, I guess was the goblin water yokai thing in the original? I don't remember. So yeah, I'm kind of retroactively massively disturbed now that the series has been canceled that they did waste an entire episode about the water goblin guy, but in the long run of the show, so many characters got pushed out of the story altogether, so at least the water goblin got his, I guess. That brings us to episode 8. So this is a really badly paced episode. Instead of letting the stories breathe like the 80s series did, this episode crams in Lum is now attending Ataru's school, which I'm pretty sure happened very early in the original 80s show. But before we even have time to explore that, they steer headfirst into Rand's origin. And hey, if you were gonna skip something, skip the fucking Gremlin story. Like, they could have done an entire episode of Lum getting into school because that was a major status quo change for Ataru's life. And then Rand's introduction is huge. Rand is essentially Lum's most formidable enemy for most of the series, so why you gotta skip over Rand like that? That's not cool. So then we go to episode 9, which is Ray's introduction episode. And once again, I cannot recommend this episode at all because this episode is a disaster. They censored the story, and this is one of my favorite stories from the original 80s version. This episode is fucking hilarious. It's maybe one of the most hilarious episodes of the entire shows. And I don't want to spoil it, but there's a major string of jokes in the 80s version that are just all about guns, and that's completely removed, nuked out of orbit in the 2022 version. And that's basically the punchline of the entire episode. The punchline of the entire episode is that guns are bad, so you took that out and now the episode makes no sense. You destroyed this episode. You committed a fucking war crime. Go to hell, 2022 remake. You fucked up episode 9. Ugh. Worst episode of the remake. Okay, next up, episode 10A, Parent Day Horrors. So this is the episode where Lum's mom visits the school to see how Lum is doing, and it's like parent-teacher day, I guess. Anyway, long story short, Lum's mom gets in a huge fight with Mendo's mom, and this is probably one of the biggest episodes in terms of Lum's mom and Mendo's mom doing anything. Either way, the remake and the original are pretty close, but I am going to give points here to the remake because the remake uses the original Lum's VA as the VA for Lum's mom here, and that makes it like a special cameo episode, whereas in the original, this basically felt like a filler episode. So yeah, good job, remake, you got one. Episode 10B, Since You're Parting. Now, the flip side, this is one I do remember. This is one of the early Ataru Actually Cares About Lum episodes, and I don't like that it's 10B here because the 2022 version doesn't give this one enough time to breathe. Like, all the sad Lum is gone, all the sad Ataru Actually Loves Lum episodes, those are the episodes that actually need time to, like, breathe and, like, calm you down from, like, the comedy to Ataru getting sad and realizing he likes Lum. Yeah, so this is the one where Lum leaves and Ataru only has, like, a doll to remember her, and then he, like, falls in love with the doll, like, more than he ever fell in love with the real Lum. So, yeah. 10 was a real mix of good and bad here. I love 10A, I didn't love 10B. Episode 11, entirely about introducing Mendo's crazy as fuck sister, Ryoko Mendo. Okay, well, this episode is okay, but as usual, the series pacing issues, I have to discuss them because we've barely had Mendo for like 3 episodes now, and we're already getting to Mendo's sister, which is like off-center Mendo family tree madness that I'm kind of shocked they're getting into already. Episode 12, introducing 10. Okay, so here's 10. Now, I hate 10. I'm going to let you guys know that up front. And I'm so glad they held off on bringing him up in the show until episode 12. That being said, this episode is actually kind of funny. And I think actually because they took longer to get to 10, maybe I'm more okay with 10 in the original version. Because the 80s series rushes out 10 way too early, and he initially just like kills Ataru's game. Since the 2022 version does a better job at explaining him and trying to make him fun, I think I like him more in the 2022 version, so I'm going to give 2022 a point here. Okay, episode 13A, the Great Off-Campus Snack Battle. Okay, so this one's rough. I don't hate the remake version, but goddamn, the 80s version is 1,000 times better. The 80s version is a fucking work of art, and the remake is just okay. The 80s version is episode 46, and it's a full-length episode, and it's like pure Mamoru Oshii at his best. It's some pretty poignant, pretty personal satire on what Oshii went through in the 1960s college campus riots. Now, I'm not sure if Oshii participated in those, or if he was just a fan of those, a supporter of those, but the remake just rushes through that, and like it completely kills the satire of what the original 80s version was really trying to convey. And the 2022 version is just so washed out, so simplified that I've just got to say the 2022 version, it's okay, but the 80s version is exceptional. 80s wins here. All right, moving on. 13B, a gift from 10. 10 gives the gang a crystal ball, which predicts who they will marry. Madness and comedy ensue. All right, so I think this is the first time in the 80s version, and actually in the 22 version as well, that they introduce Sakura's extremely minor fiance character who wears a cape. You know, like that bit-ass Seinfeld.
Why a cape? Who wears a cape? Where do you even get a cape?
You're right, it is strange.
Once again, I can't recommend the remake because they don't give this one enough time to breathe. And I think that's the only time we ever see Sakura's fiance. Sad. Episode 14, the introduction of Tobimaru Mizunokoji. So this character is Mendo's old enemy, Tobimaru, and I have no idea why they're introducing him this early. So Mendo is a rich kid that acts like a samurai, but Tobimaru is literally a samurai. But yeah, they barely introduced Mendo, so I don't know why we're getting Tobimaru. So 14A introduces him, and 14B introduces that Mendo's sister Ryoko has like the hots for him. And again, I'm not a fan of this because Tobimaru is just so off the beaten path of like the other characters. He has literally nothing to do with Ataru or Lum, and he's just a character that exists to explain some drama around Mendo, so it feels majorly off topic to get into him so early in the series, in my opinion. Okay, episode 15. This is a good remake episode. So this one deals with a situation that the original series never focused on that closely, and that is the secondary alien love triangle between Lum, Ray, and Ran. The premise of this one is that Ran loves Ray, Ray loves Lum, and Lum kind of doesn't love the both of them. So anyway, this episode tries to sort that out, and it makes for a pretty good Ran episode. Although they do get into Ran's history with Lum that the 80s version explained so much more better and was so much more funny with. So once again, this episode works really well in the remake, but only if you've already seen the 80s show. This is one of those episodes that I can only recommend if you've already seen the 80s show first. Episode 16, introducing Ryunosuke already. So shockingly, Ryunosuke showed up in episode 16. Ryunosuke was originally an endgame character for the show, but she's one of the most popular characters in the long run, basically creating Ranma 1/2 by her existence. So I guess that's why they threw her out here early. But I'm also taken back that they seemingly give Ryunosuke a pretty hard character study that some of the other characters like Ran and Mendo more likely deserved more than Ryunosuke did. So I'm kind of like convinced looking through these episodes that they tried to set up Ryunosuke's whole origin early so they could pick out a more random selection of stories from the later run of the series earlier. And yeah, so that's why we're getting Ryunosuke here. Overall, I can't really say if the 80s or the remake did this one better. Actually, no, the 80s one definitely did this better because it introduced Ryunosuke with her manga pacing, and in the remake, it just feels like they're throwing her out early for the sake of introducing her. Episode 17A, Chest Full of Longing. So this is the episode where Ryunosuke fails to buy a bra, and then she goes on a date with Shinobu to convince other people that she isn't a girl. Very comical. As far as whether the remake or the 80s version did it better, probably gonna say the 80s version did this one better. Next up, 17B, Wish Upon a Star. The family is visited by a cute merchandisable wishing star alien. So this is a pretty cute early filler episode, but since it's filler, I'd say skip it. It's just a cute episode for the sake of being cute. I don't remember if this was in the 80s because it feels like it could have been, but I don't know. I don't remember this one, so I'm just going to say remake did it better. Next up, 18A, Indelible Lipstick Magic. So this is another one focused on Ryunosuke and some magical items. This episode also has a hella cute, weird science style montage where Lum dances around in a lab coat. This one's hella funny, and I do like this one, but it was also in the original show. It was the original episode 110. So once again, I'm just going to say watch the original. Although I do like that the remake keeps its focus on Ryunosuke harder than the original did. So you know what? I might upgrade my rating on this one to say both versions are valid. Next up is episode 18B, The Lethal Attacks Yaminabe. Alright, so this was a very cultural Japanese episode to explain. The high school describes that they're going to create a Yaminabe. So this is a dark nabe hot pot, sometimes called like Russian roulette hot pot. The idea is that you eat it in the dark and people in the group will add random ingredients to it, but one evil person could be an absolute asshole and throw in like a ghost pepper or like something disgusting and ruin it for everyone else. And that's basically what Ataru sets out to do here. He's out to be the dick that ruins the party, and he's just doing that because Lum and him are fighting. And this is a pretty funny episode because it's the same running gag that's gone through the entire show. But in this episode, it's working on a very small scale instead of like the grander shit where like Ataru floods the Middle East with water. Now, I thought this was a remake of 1980s episode 87, The Grand Mysterious Matsutake Hot Pot, but apparently it's not. I'm looking it up, and apparently everyone's telling me that this was one of the first times the 2022 anime adapted a chapter that had not been adapted in the original 80s anime. I'm guessing that the 80s anime skipped this one because it was so similar to the Matsutake Hot Pot episode. So weird. I guess 2022 wins this one. Although if I did have to compare this episode to the Matsutake Hot Pot episode, the Matsutake Hot Pot episode is funnier. Episode 19A. Okay, finally we have an episode about Mendo's background. I don't know why this is in the 19s. I feel like if they introduced Mendo so early, they should have had this episode a lot early in the show. But this episode at least finally establishes that Mendo's family made their money raising octopuses. They are essentially an octopus corporation. And that's a major fact about his character. Anyway, it's a good episode, but way too late in the show, especially considering what they allowed to come before this. So, I don't know. I got nothing against this episode, but overall, just the remake did not introduce Mendo's character well. Episode 19B. Okay, this episode is a mess. In under 10 minutes, it's a combination of the episode where Lum and Ten get drunk off pickled radish, but then it starts going into a story about the Spice Girls, the bad girls that have a grudge against Lum, Benten, and Oyuki. By the way, they have a Space Girl gang, and this is why the Spice Girls have a grudge against them. Okay, this is a horrible episode. Like, even explaining this is like making my head hurt because at this point in the show, Benten and Oyuki have appeared like once, and this is the first time that we're getting information about the Spice Girls, the fact that we're in a girl gang together, the fact that they even all know each other. I strongly got to recommend the 80s series on this one because this episode is a train wreck of too much in too little time. And yeah, like both of these stories are much better served as whole half-hour episodes, which they are in the 80s, and they're explained with a lot more care. So that brings us to episode 20, Recovering Which Was Lost. Okay, so episode 20 is the full Girl Gang episode, remake of original series episode 129, making me think so much about how sloppy the remake is handling telling a continuous story versus the way the original show did it carefully and properly. And once again, I just gotta say, the original show is so much better here. The original 129 is filled with all these random references to the greatest hero of all time, the Space Sheriff Gavan. Once again, showing how self-aware and how cool the original show was. And it kind of makes me sad that the remake isn't throwing down these wild pop culture references like the original did. And for that matter, would the 2020 show throw down references to the 1980s or modern times? Who knows? But nonetheless, I'm so fucking sad that no one is talking about Space Sheriff Gavin in this episode because Original Urusei Yatsura 129 had some really funny Space Sheriff Gavin jokes. Come on. Everybody loves Space Sheriff Gavin, don't you? Don't you? Don't you? Okay, episode 21A, Cosmic Teacher CaO2. All right, so this is another straight remake, and this is a third episode in the row about Lum's Girl Gang. Kind of nice that they stuck all the Girl Gang episodes together. So this one was originally episode 85 in the 80s, and the premise here is that a giant robot eraser, Lum and her Girl Gang, killed him back in the day, but he never actually died, and because he was a robot, he just kept going, and now it's taken a couple of years, but he's finally shown up again to avenge himself at them. Now, I dig that CaO2 looks a lot more cyber in the remake, and I kind of like this episode either way because he reminds me of the old Famicom Disk System mascot. But once again, I have to recommend the 80s because they gave more time to the concept and made it work better. Episode 21B, ooh, scary, a voodoo doll. Okay, so this is the episode where Ryoko curses Mendo, and then him and Ataru have a moment of bonding together. And I'm glad we're finally getting these Mendo character development episodes, but they're too little too late, and I'm annoyed that they're occurring so far away from his introduction episode. Anyway, this is a fine episode of the remake, but once again, I'm not happy with the way the remake is handling character development. All right, next up, episode 22A, Big Bottle, Little Bottle. All right, this is a really silly story where Ten shrinks Lum down to action figure size with a magic bottle, and then to unshrink her, they need to find a giant magic bottle. This is a funny story. I'm okay with the remake of this one because this isn't the best story, and I feel like this one deserves to be skipped through. 22B, When Love Strikes. Oh, this is the episode where Shinobu meets the fox. Okay, so wait. In the original, there were several episodes where Shinobu met a fox. And this is one of those quintessential episodes of the remake that explains this was a thing that happened, and this was a thing that people loved, but it doesn't linger on it long enough to explain why people love it. The first Fox episode was good, and that was episode 122. But then when the Fox came back in episode 158 to finish out his story, that episode was freaking great. That was the episode where Kenshiro had a cameo and he was just singing the class. That ended up being ranked as the 6th best episode of the show in Japan. Meanwhile, this is the first and as far as I can think of, the last time we saw the Fox in the remake. So that's kind of sucks, right? All right, finally we've reached the season finale of season 1, and it's the Miss Tomabiki contest. And yeah, this is the third time a remake episode has officially taken a full half hour to do a story. And yeah, this is a remake of the original episode 91. So once again, this is a failure for the remake. The original 91 was so much better. It had some of the best gags in the series, and they were all once again revolving around Lum's stormtroopers, the gang that Megane leads. Cutting out Megane cuts out the heart of the show. There were so many jokes in this episode that are so reliant on Megane. Long story short, it turns out that all the other girls in town have their own creepy fan club stalkery posses that are kind of at war with Megane's fan club creepy stalker posse. And some of these stalker posses are really, really offensive and really hilarious in ways that are no longer politically correct in 2022. But that's what makes them so damn funny, and that's what makes this episode one of the best episodes of the original show. So yeah, the remake is okay, but the original is once again a masterpiece in terms of humor, in terms of how unrestricted it was and how free it was. So this is one of the ones where the remake's okay, but the original is fucking phenomenal. Okay, so we're halfway through the show now. That was the end of season 1. And season 1 was, like I said, just a speed run to the status quo at the end of the 80s show. It had a lot of lackluster episodes, and it's very hard for me to recommend season 1 outside of a few filler episodes like the Pond Gremlin one, the one that introduces Toby Maru. And yeah, season 1 has some really bad episode pacing issues. If you can watch those minor episodes in a vacuum outside the pacing episodes after you watch the 80s series, that's pretty much the best way to watch season 1. Otherwise, if you see an episode that you recognize from the 80s series, you should probably just skip it. Moving on to season 2, this has a lot more of the same problems, but I do think season 2 was overall better than season 1 because season 2 tried harder to be an epilogue for the entire show, and season 2 had a lot more callbacks to the 80s show with the knowledge that I guess by the time season 2 rolled around, they kind of figured, fuck it. If you're watching this, you've already seen the entire 80s show. So here we go, season 2. Episode 24A, Fantasy Bubblegum. All right, so this actually ended up being a pretty interesting one. So what happened here is, I've been complaining about the 2022 remake doing a lot of Frankenplots. So this is one of the first times I can find a Frankenplot in the 80s series. So in the 80s series, they combined the Fantasy Bubblegum storyline with a storyline about Lum having a ice block that makes herself cooler. And long story short, they combined them weird. So I'm on the fence on this one again. I do like that the 2022 version is giving you the original unedited version of the original story. But on the flip side, once again, the 2022 version just isn't going as far with the lecherous humor as the 80s version did. So 80s version is funnier. 2022 is more true to the manga. Episode 24B, Love Knows No Barriers. So this is the episode where Ataru bashes Lum in the head with a rice cooker and damages her brain. He damages her ability to speak Japanese, and then he just has to put up with her speaking her alien language. Now, I'll say that I was kind of shocked that the remake even tackled this one, because in season 1, it seemed like they were like trying to tone down and be more politically correct. And this is one of the original like dirty episodes that like really like, is Ataru's just straight up abusive in this episode. So I was just kind of shocked to see it, because I felt like in season 1, they really toned down some of the violence. Episode 25, the story about finding any trace of Ryunosuke's mom. So once again, the remake just bungled this one. This is a remake of original episode 81. And while I won't say the original is a good episode, and I won't say the remake is a bad episode, the remake just doesn't handle this one because this story, I think even in the original manga, the story never ended in a solid or positive way. It just kind of ends. So I guess overall my point here is that both versions of the story are flawed. But once again, I have to say the 80s version is less flawed, because the 80s version at least goes back to the concept a few more times and eventually tries to clarify what it was trying to explain. So it has that advantage. Okay, episode 26, Electric Jungle. Now, this is an interesting one because technically I completely forgot about this episode. It's one of the last episodes in the original show. It's episode 192 out of 194. Basically the last episode before the endgame ending kicked in. So quite honestly, this was a weird one for me, because at first I did want to praise the remake on this one because I entirely forgot the plot of this one. But the plot line here, the Jungle Boy character, yeah, I was willing to give this a point to the remake because I thought they were reintroducing him early because they were going to do some new stuff with him, but they never did. So that's a fail. So since this episode was a waste of time, I once again have to retroactively award the point to the 80s show, because even though this episode and the 80s version are almost completely identical, the one way they're different is the 80s version includes Megane in the plot, and Megane instantly improves the quality of the plot. Episode 27A, The Love Thief. Alright, so this is the episode where Kurama and Ran fight, and I barely remember this one, but I am glad Kurama came back one more time because I like the Ran episodes. Episode 27 Part B plus episode 28 The Whole Thing. That Mizuno Koji Girl. Okay, so this is a 3-episode setup for Asuka Mizuno Koji. Asuka Mizuno Koji is Tobimaru's sister, and she is deadly afraid of men, which Ataru and Ryunosuke end up using to fuck with her. And this string of episodes kind of sucks because we've only had Tobimaru for barely 1 episode, and they still haven't even explained why Tobimaru matters, so I don't know why they're getting into his sister. I can't really recommend these episodes unless you were unclear about the Asuka character, but back in the original 80s series, the Asuka episodes aren't particularly great in that series either. But you know what? In the 80s, Asuka doesn't show up until after the first 100 episodes. So by the time she does show up, Mendo and Ataru have gotten a little bit old, and Asuka is kind of an interesting switch up to the original formula. But throwing her out early here and dedicating so much screen time to her is kind of a disaster. Episode 29B, Lum Becomes a Cow. Okay, so this one's hard for me. This is a classic episode, and overall, I don't think the remake really improved the story at all, but I do think David Productions tried really, really hard here to do the animation better on this one and to push some more emotions through the animation. But once again, because they rushed through the episode and because this is another sad episode where the sad episodes need to breathe, I can't recommend this one. Like, the animation's beautiful, but again, with the sad episodes, you really need to take time to like fully convey that Ataru does care for Lum, and rushing through those just makes Ataru seem like more of an asshole. Episode 30A, the Eerie Earmuffs. So this is the one where Ten and Ataru switch bodies, and this is an early season 1 episode from the 80s show. It's episode 24. Once again, I think the remake blazes through the story, and that almost feels like they waste this one, because this is an episode that you can have a lot of fun with, and so that the fact the remake skipped it over for the most part feels like the remake's just not doing these stories justice. Episode 30B, 31, and 32A, the Time Rabbit Inaba Saga. All right, so I'm going to give this one to the remake. This is one of the ones where they put enough care and enough time to create a late game Urusei Yatsura story, and they actually put so much time and care into it that they improved it. Now, this one is a huge mess that they stretched through 3 episodes, even though timing-wise it should have just been 2 episodes. I don't know who like missettled the time, but yeah, that seems like an oversight. But anyway, so the Inaba the Time Rabbit story was a story that was previously only seen in Urusei Yatsura OVA 3, and once again with the Jungle Boy story, this was a late game story that they just like kind of got to at the very end of things. Now, I kind of think throwing it in early meant that they were going to use Inaba a little bit more, and Inaba shows up one more time, but I kind of wish Inaba had shown up more considering the amount of time they put into him. But still, I kind of love these episodes. This is the remake at its best because this deals with like potential ways the show could have ended, and I feel like the remake like kind of like explores those endings in a very final and closed out sort of way. So finally the remake gets a pretty good point on this one. Episode 33A, Haunted Mendo. All right, so this is another good remake episode. This is a sad story about Mendo's dead octopus. I remember briefly this story was included in the third Urusei Yatsura movie as a subplot, and the remake does okay with this one. And then it ties the story into episode 33B, Last Date, where Ataru goes on a date with a dead girl who can't move on. And so the dead girl gives Ataru a lot of grief, but he puts up with it because he's trying to be nice and he generally has feelings for this dead girl. So yeah, episode 33 was a good remake episode. It's a super special ghost story episode, and yeah, this is one of the better episodes out of season 2. Episode 34A, Case of the Battered Principal. I think this was the detective parody episode. I kind of zoned out on this one, but you know, it's very cliche. I'm going to give them credit though. The remake pulled the story out of a chapter that had not been adapted in the 1981 series, and I'm kind of impressed because I didn't think this was one that didn't get adapted, but yeah, they surprised me this time. I'm also going to real quick touch on Home Visit Blues. So this is a series of end credit gags in the remake, but in the original series, it was actually its own episode. So I think I kind of do enjoy the way the remake paced them out as a series of end credit gags, because otherwise Anson Mark is not that interesting a character. But nonetheless, if you want to see all these all together, the original 80s series did them as one episode. Episode 34B, Secret Garden. This is the one where Rand nearly kills the Earth with alien plants. Man, the Earth really gets killed a lot with alien plants on the show, right? I'm glad we got another Rand episode, but once again, this one's one of the ones where I kind of zoned out on. Okay, continuing the Rand kick. Episode 35A is the episode where Rand kills Ataru with a poison cupcake. This one was pretty funny. I guess I'll give this one to the remake. And the main reason I'm giving this one to the remake is because the original 80s version of this one has a lot of weird filler content, like Lum goes to another planet and she like fights the queen from Alice in Wonderland in like a golf game, and that kind of really underscores the serious nature of, oh fuck, Ataru is dying. So yeah, the remake sticks to the plot better, and I'm happy with that. Followed up by episode 35B. All right, so this was a pretty close one. Like, initially I wanted to give this to the remake because the remake did okay with it, but nah, I'm sorry. The 80s version just ends it on such a more higher emotional note where the fox actually achieves happiness having carried out his plan. On the flip side, the 80s isn't perfect either. There's like a long sequence with like some Looney Tunes dogs that was kind of cringe, but like overall, I just gotta say the 80s landed this one a lot better, whereas it feels like the remake cuts off without completing the story. Okay, so next up is episode 36, The Wretched Shutaro. So this is a pretty cool one. In this one, the gang somehow travels back in time to stop Mendo from being an asshole, so they find him as a child and then proceed to abuse him as a child, which doesn't seem like it's going to help. Actually, it seems like overall the time travel in this story doesn't actually change anything, but I guess this is one of the ones that's kind of good either way. I think I am going to give the remake a little bit more credit on this one because they did dedicate a full episode to it. But once again, I wish they had put some of the Mendo episodes more towards the front of the show and not include them as like a last idea. And then, holy fuck, you guys. Okay, so this is the biggest slight I have against the remake. 37 and 38 are all even more stories about Asuka, Mizuno Koji. Holy shit, they literally wasted almost half of season 2 on Asuka, Mizuno Koji, one of the most minor and ancillary characters in the show. They gave Asuka literally a quarter of the second season, 1/8 of the entire show. How? How was this allowed? I'm purely baffled by this. Just baffled. Why? Did someone really have a hard-on for Asuka and Mizuno Koji that bad? Like, these episodes are completely skippable. I guess if you want a complete condensed version of Asuka's entire storyline, the season delivers it, but goddamn, these were not fun episodes. So I looked up what the deal was with this episode. Apparently in the 80s, this was Storm Raising Date, and it was one episode, but in the manga, it was 5 volumes. So long story short, the 80s series cut a bunch of stuff out to fit into a half hour. And on the flip side, I guess 2022 has more of the original manga content spread over 2 episodes. But again, Asuka is not the best character to focus on for 2 episodes. So I kind of side with like the 80s crew that, yeah, this doesn't need to be 2 episodes. Why? Okay, that brings us to episode 39 and 48. Now, on the flip side, these are probably retroactively my favorite episodes of the entire remake. I did an entire video essay on just these 2 episodes and why these 2 are the best ones, but long story short, 39 is a faithful remake of a late-stage Urusei Yatsura episode introducing an obscure character, Ryunosuke's fiancé, and in episode 40, they actually take it one more step to better explain that character, explain why that character is Ryunosuke's fate, and that helps close out Ryunosuke's character arc. So 40A ends up being my entire favorite episode of the entire remake because it's probably the only episode that actually successfully advanced the plot. Great job. Episode 40B was the Jari 10 episode. This episode was not great, but once again, it had a couple of funny gags. And the best thing I can even remember about this one was that since Twitter exists now, this one had a great online discussion around it about censorship because everyone was really, really confident that this episode was going to be censored like the Ray episode was in season 1, but it ended up not being censored, and that kind of threw everyone for a loop. Okay, so this is another previously unadapted chapter. They're throwing down this one at the last minute, and this one very successfully utilizes Inaba. Now, Inaba finally takes us to some new ground, and anyway, this was just an episode that mostly focuses on the relationship between Shinobu, Anabu, Latar, and Lum as they all chill and talk at a cafe. But I'm just really happy that the remake's throwing down some new content finally. Thank God. I just kind of hope it wasn't too little too late. Okay, next up, 42A, Lum's Wrath. Okay, this is the Enraged Lum episode. This is another very early in the manga 10-focus story, and honestly, this is one of the ones that the remake and the original did so similarly that the remake felt like I was watching a remake. So, extreme indifference here, not really better or worse, but they're like literally the same episode 1 for 1. 42B, Steal the Heart. This is another weird Ran Lum Alien Chaos episode. I'm going to say the remake didn't handle this one as good as the 80s. So, yeah, I just got to move on now. All right, last 3 episodes of Urusei Yatsura Remake, 43, 44, and 45. This is a 3-parter Boy Meets Girl, and it's basically a not as good remake of the last Urusei Yatsura film, Urusei Yatsura: The Final Chapter. Now, the story kind of starts out of nowhere with Lum just getting instantly kidnapped by a guy who looks like Merrick from Yu-Gi-Oh! And anyway, Ataru, Mendo, and the girl gang get together and try to save Lum. It's really nice seeing them get back to a high-stakes episode and everything, but the events of these episodes are so overstuffed and complicated that it really just didn't feel that great. Like, both Ataru and Lum act like huge assholes here because of the pacing issues, and I guess I would rather go back to watch the movie now that I've seen the remake. I guess they remade this one because I'm reading up on it. Apparently the movie changed some stuff around from the original manga, so David Production went back to the original manga as always. I guess let me know if you guys want me to review the last episode movie. I would be willing to reconsider it under the current circumstances because now I'm kind of curious where I can see the direct issues with this one. But yeah, so once again, season 2 was a little bit better than season 1. I like that they brought back Inaba a couple of times. I like that they wrapped out Ryunosuke's storyline much better. I did not like that so many episodes were focused on Asuka and Mizuno Koji. But overall, I feel like the second season was trying more hardly to appeal to hardcore fans. And in doing so, maybe they went too hard because no one fucking gives a shit about Asuka. I'm sorry. Overall, I'm really disappointed that they decided to end the anime at this point because it was just kind of getting good in season 2. I feel like season 2 was the show starting to right itself and deliver to those fans the long-awaited unadapted episodes. I really wanted to soak in what the remake did, so I rewatched a bunch of episodes of the 80s show to do this review, and it kind of occurred to me finally that essentially when you really get down to it, everyone was kind of hoping that they would do like a Dragon Ball Z Kai thing and do like a best of Urusei Yatsura, and they kind of really didn't do that. It felt like what they actually did was they did literally every single character's introduction episode. Like, to break it down, in the 80s series, Urusei Yatsura has kind of a flow. You start with there's only Shinobu and Ataru, and then Lum is added. And then you get episodes playing with Lum, and then Ten is added, and you get episodes playing with Ten. And then you get Mendo added, and then you get episodes playing with Mendo. My point is that, as the show goes on, the original 80s version is very careful to introduce a character, play with the character, show how the character changes the status quo, do some adventures with the character, and then move on to another character. Whereas in the remake, it's just new character after new character after new character without any chance to really relish or get to know the characters, and that kind of sucks. So overall, the remake is kind of good if you just want to know all the characters, but it doesn't have any of the content that makes you kind of like or understand all the characters, and that's kind of why the remake is a bit of a failure. The other big thing is that people were really, really hoping that the remake would adapt some new chapters because famously, the original anime was canceled before the manga was canceled, so there's a handful of chapters at the end that just were never adapted. And now that it's all been said and done, the remake only got 3 new chapters in. That's insane. I can't believe they bungled this badly. I'm not entirely sure how well this show did in Japan either, but considering that there was really no buzz about it until it ended, maybe that was a bad sign. Either way, now that's over, people are on pins and needles expecting another Rumiko adaptation. Now in America, the expectation is that we're going to get Ranma 1/2 next, but that's not the case in Japan. Funny enough, in Japan, what people are expecting next is the next Rumiko anime, My Son Ikoku. Do you think My Son Ikoku should be readapted? I don't. Just being real with you guys, Ranma needs a remake more than Ikoku does. Ikoku is very 80s and has a very substantially clear and very settled ending, unlike Ranma and Urusei Yatsura. I would also say Ranma is a little bit more timeless, whereas My Son Ikoku is super 1980s Japan. And yeah, Ranma needs a remake because it has a vague ending just like Urusei had. Anyway, I guess this will be the last time I ever discuss the Urusei Yatsura remake, unless they ever go back to it in another movie or in another season in the future. Leave a comment if you need me to explain anything else about the original show, the remake show, or if you want me to do that video essay about Megane, or review any of the previous Urusei Yatsura OVAs and movies. I'll think about doing it because I feel like doing it right now. Oh, okay, I guess we are doing Ranma 1/2. Enjoy your Ranma 1/2. It's going to turn everyone gay. Ha ha ha. Okay, that's all for me. Holy fuck, I talked for almost an hour. Okay, bye.